First method, impalement. One of the most infamous execution methods in history was impalement. The method became especially associated with the 15th century ruler Vlad the Impaler, whose reputation for cruelty spread across Europe and eventually inspired the legend of Dracula. Impalement was designed to be terrifying not only for the victim, but for everyone who witnessed it. The execution began with a long wooden stake, often several meters tall. The stake was sharpened at one end and planted firmly into the ground. The condemned person would then be forced onto the stake, which was slowly driven through the body. The executioner's goal was not always to kill immediately. In many cases, the stake was carefully inserted in a way that avoided vital organs. If the executioner was experienced, the victim could remain alive for hours, sometimes even longer. Once the body was positioned on the stake, the pole was raised upright so the victim hung suspended above the ground. The weight of the body slowly forced the stake deeper. This process made impalement one of the most agonizing punishments ever recorded. Historical sources describe entire landscapes filled with impaled victims. When enemies approached certain cities, they sometimes saw hundreds or even thousands of bodies displayed on stakes outside the walls. These scenes became known as forests of the impaled. Travelers recorded that the smell alone could be overwhelming. The sight of so many bodies left a powerful psychological impact on anyone who witnessed it. According to historical accounts, Vlad the Impaler used this method strategically during conflicts with the Ottoman Empire. When invading armies approached Wallachian territory, they sometimes encountered rows of impaled prisoners placed along the roads. The purpose was simple: fear. Even experienced soldiers could be shaken by the sight of such displays. The message was clear: anyone who opposed the ruler could suffer the same fate. Although impalement became strongly linked with Vlad III, the method was not limited to one region. Variations of impalement were used in different parts of the world, including the Middle East, parts of Asia, and Eastern Europe. But as horrifying as impalement was, another execution method described in ancient records was even more disturbing. Second method, scaphism. One of the most disturbing punishments ever described in ancient texts is known as scaphism. The word comes from the Greek term for boats. According to ancient sources, this method was used in the Persian Empire as a form of extreme punishment for serious crimes. The process began with two hollow wooden boats or logs. The condemned person was placed inside the first boat, lying on their back. The second boat was then placed over the top, trapping the body inside while leaving the head, arms, and legs exposed. Once the victim was secured, the next step began. The person was force-fed large amounts of milk and honey. At first, this may sound harmless, but the real purpose was far sinister. The mixture caused severe digestive distress, and it was also poured across the body. The sweetness attracted insects. Flies gathered quickly, drawn to the honey coating the exposed skin. As time passed, insects began laying eggs in the wounds and on the body. Because the victim was trapped between the boats, escape was impossible. Over time, the person became weaker due to dehydration, infection, and insect activity. Ancient historians wrote that the punishment could last several days before death finally occurred. While some modern historians question whether the descriptions were exaggerated, the story of scaphism has become one of the most notorious examples of cruelty in ancient punishment systems. Even if some details were embellished, the concept itself reveals an important truth about many ancient execution methods. They were designed not simply to end life quickly. They were designed to maximize suffering and create unforgettable warnings. Stories of punishments like scaphism spread far beyond the locations where they occurred. People who never witnessed the execution itself still heard the descriptions and imagined the horror.
Third method, breaking on the wheel. By the Middle Ages, many executions had turned into large public spectacles. Entire towns gathered in central squares where wooden platforms were built for punishment. Among the most feared execution methods used across parts of Europe was breaking on the wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel. The device itself looked simple. It was a large wooden wheel, similar to those used on wagons or carts. But the simplicity of the device hid the brutality of the punishment. The condemned person was tied to a wooden frame or directly onto the wheel. Their arms and legs were stretched out so that the limbs rested across the spokes. Once the victim was secured, the executioner stepped forward with a heavy iron bar or hammer. The punishment began with the limbs. One by one, the executioner struck the victim's arms and legs with powerful blows, shattering the bones. Each strike crushed bone and muscle, while the victim remained fully conscious. Depending on the sentence, the executioner might break several bones or continue striking until every limb was destroyed. The brutality of the method was not only meant to cause pain, it was designed to create a dramatic and unforgettable spectacle for the crowd watching below. After the bones were shattered, the body was sometimes woven through the spokes of the wheel itself. The broken limbs were bent around the wooden frame so that the victim's body became entangled within the structure. Then the wheel was lifted onto a tall pole and displayed in a public place. In some cases, the victim remained alive for hours after the punishment, exposed to the sun, wind, and the eyes of thousands of spectators. Travelers entering a city might see these wheels mounted along roads or near city gates. They served as permanent reminders of the consequences of serious crimes, such as murder, treason, or highway robbery. The purpose was not only punishment, it was intimidation. Anyone passing by could see exactly what happened to those who challenged the law. Breaking on the wheel remained in use in parts of Europe for centuries before eventually being abandoned as legal systems began to change. Fourth method, the brazen bull. Among the most infamous execution devices described in ancient history is the brazen bull. This device was said to have been created in ancient Sicily during the rule of the tyrant Phalaris in the 6th century BCE. Unlike other execution methods, the brazen bull was designed to be both a punishment and a theatrical display. The device was a life-sized statue of a bull made entirely of bronze. The statue was hollow inside, with a door built into the side. The condemned person was locked inside the hollow metal body. Once the door was sealed, a fire was lit beneath the statue. As the flames grew stronger, the bronze slowly heated. The temperature inside the statue began to rise until it became unbearable. But the device contained another disturbing feature. According to historical descriptions, the bull was constructed with a system of pipes leading from the inside of the statue to the mouth of the bull. As the victim screamed from the heat, the sound passed through these pipes. Instead of sounding like human screams, the noise was transformed into something resembling the roar of a bull. To the people standing outside, it seemed as if the bronze animal itself was making the sound. This detail turned the execution into a horrifying spectacle. Spectators watching the punishment did not hear human cries for help. Instead, they heard the terrifying roar echoing from the metal statue. Whether the brazen bull was used frequently or exaggerated in ancient stories is still debated by historians. Ancient writers sometimes amplified tales of cruelty to emphasize the reputation of tyrants. However, the story of the device became one of the most famous examples of extreme punishment in classical history.
Fifth method, the guillotine. By the late 18th century, attitudes toward punishment in Europe had begun to change. For centuries, execution methods had often been designed to cause prolonged suffering and to serve as public spectacles, but a growing number of philosophers and reformers began to argue that justice should be different. Punishment, they said, should be swift, consistent, and equal for everyone. These ideas gained momentum during the political upheaval that would become known as the French Revolution. Before this period, execution methods often depended on social class. Nobles might be granted relatively quick deaths, such as beheading by sword, while common criminals were subjected to harsher and more prolonged punishments. Revolutionary thinkers believed this inequality had to end. One man who strongly supported reform was Joseph Ignace Guillotine. Guillotine proposed that executions should be carried out using a mechanical device that would guarantee the same method for everyone and minimize unnecessary suffering. Although he did not personally invent the machine, his name would forever become associated with it. The device became known as the guillotine. Its design was simple but highly effective. A tall wooden frame held a heavy angled blade suspended at the top. Beneath the blade was a wooden restraint where the condemned person's neck would be positioned. When the executioner released a lever, the blade dropped instantly. The sharp blade and the force of gravity ensured that death occurred almost immediately. Supporters of the guillotine believed it represented progress compared to older execution methods that could involve prolonged suffering or repeated blows from an executioner's axe. The guillotine was considered more humane. It also removed human error from the process. In earlier executions, a poorly aimed strike could leave the victim alive and suffering, while the executioner attempted multiple blows. The mechanical precision of the guillotine eliminated that uncertainty.